So while you're setting that up, I'll prep everybody here. The presentation I'm doing today, Food Entrepreneurs in Crisis, Preparing for After the Pandemic. Uh, what I'm doing, I'm speaking a lot to independent entrepreneurs, folks that aren't in larger systems. There's a lot to prepare for here. There's a big economy out there in this space. We all know that there's a lot to struggle through. Um, before the pandemic, and I think after it's going to be exacerbated. So I will tell you, for those of you that are gritty entrepreneurs that are really trying to drive home your, ag and food products, there might be a little bit of tension up front with regard to some of the challenges. But I also want to emphasize that I think that I end this on a high note, that there's a lot of opportunities out there if we work through our supportive institutions. Um, so let's go ahead and move to the second slide then. So I just want to give you just a brief overview here. In California itself, our working landscapes, as we're calling it, rural landscapes, natural landscapes, or whatnot. In terms of the throughput that comes from agriculture itself, if you look here on the right-hand side, it's really sizable. This is $263 billion. And this is before we do value-added processing. California, of course, is known for its agriculture. We also have some of the biggest ag companies, and the value-added process clearly adds more to our economy. Um, Go next slide. This slide here shows you the concentration of who has power at what level of the value chain within our ag and food system. Again, those of you that are startups that are new or that are just trying to get a toehold in the sector know that there are big entities that are out there. It's really challenging to get through. Um, so whether it comes down to seed companies for those of you that are trying to do indoor grow operations, to farmers, to food processors, manufacturers, uh, you know, the big guys control the market in these areas. Uh, Next slide. And just want to give you a little taste of this. These are some wonderful infographics from a colleague out of Michigan State. Uh, this is to show you the concentration in the organic industry. I'm sure that a lot of you know about this, but some of the brands that folks think that are small and local are actually part of your legacy brands in ag and food. Go to the next slide. Yeah, so then whenever you want to get these products out to market, we then have to appeal to these particular groups. United Natural Foods is going to be one of the big players that many folks works with. And one of the challenges that's going on here is that Amazon is now getting into their turf. United Natural Foods used to be the main provider for Whole Foods, and they still are. But as many of us know, Amazon purchased Whole Foods, and eventually Amazon's going to be squeezing out United Natural Foods. And there's a big question as to whether or not we're going to be working with Amazon more and more as time goes on. Next slide. So this is going back more to the farmers and producer side, but even the seed industry is getting heavily concentrated. Bayer, I think many folks know they bought out Monsanto recently. Um, these are just becoming more and more influential, and to have voice in these systems is more and more troubling. Next slide. I use this to talk to my folks in California to show them that even in California in the wine industry, it's heavily concentrated. E&J Gallo is obviously a big player. The wine group is another. And then there's a series of other small producers within that. Sure, there's some upstarts that are coming at this from an orientation where they're having to go out and seek capital, but a lot of the small players are actually folks that are pretty well off and have their own source of financing. Next slide. Now, I love this image here. I'm from the rural Midwest. I'm from central Illinois. I remember in the late 90s and early 2000s as Walmart was coming to town and they were squeezing out the small businesses. Now what we're seeing is Amazon is doing the same thing. Amazon is not only building its own grocery stores, but they've bought out Whole Foods. They're looking at buying supply chains. And additionally, they're looking at buying up other vendors that are related to delivery along the way too. So this means, again, we're going to have to be playing with bigger and bigger actors. There's also this movement toward platforms. So Amazon, of course, is a platform, but there's other things out there such as Yelp. Uber is another example of a platform that's out there. Um, just to make you aware, those of you that don't know about this, but the founder of Uber, I think it's Travis Kalanick, something like that. He got squeezed out at Uber, and now his next venture that he's doing are a series of community kitchens. And the idea is his centralized firm would own these community kitchens. They would compete against the community kitchens that we've been working on building throughout the United States. And there's a question as to whether or not, if you use his community kitchen, does he have an ownership stake in your business when you jump off? So this is before COVID hit. There were a lot of challenges in the food sector then, and now what COVID is doing is really forcing us to reassess and to be honest with ourselves about where the food system's at. We'll go to the next slide. So recently, I put together a brief document, a practical guide, Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, or known as the CARES Act. That's going to be available to everybody here as a PDF, so you can refer to it. The main thing I wanted to draw your attention to is, what's inside of this, the CARES package. And this gives you a good breakdown. Obviously, big business gets the lion's share of assistance here, but small businesses do have access to a line of credit. There's three main areas. There's the emergency grants. It provides up to $10 billion for grants up to $10,000 for emergency funds. There's also the forgivable loans program that has been very popular. It's 350 billion. It was recently re-upped. There was a lot of news about how small businesses went to use the program and it was quickly depleted. I believe it's depleted for a second time. Um, but it allows you to take out loans in order to keep your payroll going so you don't have to fire your staff. Additionally, there's relief for existing loans, um, you know, for to cover payments under the Small Business Administration. Now, when you look at all this as a whole, it kind of looks like a depressing situation here. So before this happened, things were consolidated. Now that we're under shelter in place, now that we're under COVID, small businesses are really challenged. Amazon's flourishing, Walmart's flourishing. What are we to do? And so I wanted to pivot to that briefly about what your options are. Um, and I want to say it's not going to be easy, but I also want to say that this is a long overdue conversation, that small foods entrepreneurs need to be working together within their communities in order to carve out space. So let's go to the next slide. What I think we need to be aware of is there's this opportunity to engage with economic development institutions. Uh, for decades, the narrative on economic development in the United States has been what I call smokestack chasing. And about 95% of all municipalities use this approach, which is we're going to go out and we're going to attract and retain big firms to create a bunch of jobs in our community. That was part of the dialogue with the whole HQ2 headquarters, right? So for over a year, all these municipalities spent millions and millions of dollars trying to attract an already profitable business to come to their community. The argument for why folks focus on this is it's going to create high wage careers, it's going to enhance the tax base, it's going to increase opportunities for entrepreneurship, and that we should allow localities to keep doing this because they know it's best. But the results are this kind of approach creates a limited amount of jobs. They're typically service oriented and unsustainable because what happens is you get a big business coming to your community, and once a subsidy runs out that's been provided to them, they then turn around and say, we need another subsidy if we're going to stay in your community. So this is sort of this race to the bottom approach. It pits communities against each other. And we know that in a lot of these areas where there's hard hit communities, that if they would work together, there could be more bang for the buck opportunities. Um, so one thing I wanted to make you all aware of in terms of how we can get our hands wrapped around this is, first of all, we have a ton of community-based institutions that we could be tapping into, especially in the ag and food space. There's farm bureaus. I know that there could be some consternation about dealing with some farm bureaus, but I'll tell you that even in more conservative areas, and what I mean by that is more risk adverse, A lot of farm bureaus are actually paying more attention to value added. They want to see more small producers. They want to see more small food entrepreneurship. I think there's opportunities to engage with these institutions, and they're incredibly powerful. There's also farmers unions, of course, and there's your state Department of Ag, and not to mention cooperative extension. We're out there. Myself, I'm a community economic development specialist at the University of California, Davis. We have a very big network. We have a lot of expertise to be tapped into. And through our network, there's tons of resources that are available too. Uh, Another thing to look at is with your bank of choice or your lender of choice and credit unions. I would very much encourage folks to not be complacent in this environment. What I mean is, if you see that your sales are down, if you see that you've got debts piling up, I would absolutely engage with your bank or credit union and talk with them about what your options are, whether it's to put a pause on your loans or these sort of things. It can't hurt to have that conversation, but where you be even more empowered is if you work with your peers in this space and you go into your lenders collectively and ask them. That collective power will help to influence how they work with you. Another group, I mentioned the credit unions. Credit unions, you need to remember, are actually member owned. So they are intended to work for the local community. Your credit unions also have access to these things called CUSOs, Credit Union Service Organizations. What they do is essentially, instead of your local credit union solely doing consumer loans, if they want to get into business lending, they form a co-op of co-ops. So about 10 credit unions will come together to form a CUSO, as they call it, and those will specialize in business lending. So you actually have a lot more options and opportunities in your local community than you might think. Um, let's go to the next slide. And for those folks that know me, you know that one of my areas of expertise is cooperatives. This is an infographic from the National Cooperative Business Association. It's to show you that there's a significant amount of cooperatives across a number of sectors. And so for our purposes, we're going to be more interested here in finance, the credit unions. We're going to be interested in agriculture, and we're going to be interested in grocery stores. Fortunately, there's a big support system out there. There are associations such as National Cooperative Grocers. There is the Independent Natural Food Retailers Association. These are all wonderful groups to talk to in order to get your product out to market. I would be having those conversations now. And again, I would discourage you from doing it alone. I would encourage you to do it with folks in your community, as well as your extension agents that are working with you on these issues. Um, the other thing to mention too is as you get involved in the ag and food space, there's additional lending that's available there too. There are farm credit services, there's CoBank, and there's also National Cooperative Bank. So again, it opens up a lot more opportunities. Let's go to the next slide. This is just to remind the folks that aren't aware, why it is that cooperatives matter in this. Cooperatives are democratic institutions. They have a significant scale in the United States. They're there for their membership. They're there for their local community. So they're designed and operated to benefit you and your community. Go to the next slide. This is a great map from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's just to show you all the cooperatives in the United States. If you look where you're at, you'll probably see that there's a bundle of cooperatives right there in your backyard. We'll go to the next slide. Here's a number of brands that you probably recognize that are in the co-op space. Let's go to the next slide. And here's some additional brands. What's really fascinating about this particular slide is it shows you a number of these cooperatives that are associations. So they represent local independence, like an Ace Hardware, a restaurant supply chain, and this sort of thing. By contacting these centralized groups, you get access to hundreds, if not thousands, of potential vendors to work with. So again, this could be a real force multiplier to help everybody out. Let's go to the next slide. And I want to make you aware, there's enormous resources that are out there to help you out in this. One of the things that's a problem with both the economic development space and the co-op space is that these actors are really trying to operate in social purpose, so they don't do a good job of talking about the good work they do to the broader community. Um, I am more than happy to be a conduit to help folks out if you wish to get additional information. Um, if we can go back to that slide though, on the economic development, slide 10, I believe. Now, those of you that pull down the slide, you'll see that I have some additional information in there about that. I would very much encourage you to also have a conversation with your regional, your local economic development agencies. Again, for years they've put a great deal of their resources toward attraction and retention. I think that there's a big case that could be made in how we look at a post-COVID economy and having economic development agencies divert at least 10 to 20% of their resources to local economic development. I don't understand for the life of me why it is these local agencies have been taking local tax dollars and trying to attract external agents when we could be diverting a share of this toward local economic development. When you take these local economic development dollars and you plug it in to a broader network, such as the cooperatives and associations, Farm Bureau and Extension, it's a real force multiplier that could help folks out with not only recovering after the COVID crisis, but also preparing their business for the next stage. So with that, if y'all have any questions, I'll be hanging around here for Q&A. Thank you all for having me here. I really appreciate it and hope this is useful information.